Silent Hill. You might have heard of it. One of the most influential and at one point successful survival horror series to ever release. Even people who have never touched a Silent Hill game at least know the basics, like there's a bit of fog everywhere. The series not only had an impact on horror gaming, but the entire horror genre as well. You may have heard of a little niche streaming show called Stranger Things. The look and feel of the Upside Down was directly inspired by the town of Silent Hill. So yeah, that's pretty neat. At one point, Silent Hill was a juggernaut of not just survival horror, but horror in general, standing shoulder to shoulder with Resident Evil. However, that time has come and gone. The general consensus is, as far as I can tell, that the series fell off after the fourth mainline game and never quite recovered. None of the games past the original 4 could match up to what had come before, and the movies, well, they were certainly made, so you can give them that, I guess. There's been a few attempts to revive the decaying corpse of whatever the protagonist of the first game is named, but none of them really hit. Or in one instance, they did hit and got dropped anyway because Konami can't play nice. Now it just seems like they're throwing a bunch of random ideas at the wall to see what sticks. I mean, they are attempting an interactive streaming series that is basically a supermassive game with the added twist of Twitch chat voting for what happens in the show. Genuinely cannot wait to watch the chat band together to speedrun killing off every character as fast as they can. It is going to be spectacular. There's also whatever the hell Silent Hill F and Silent Hill Downfall are. Not sure what's going on there, but they could be good, you know, maybe. And of course, among all that, Konami had a modern gaming moment and decided to remake one of their classic games for the current gaming audience. Starting with the obvious choice, Silent Hill 2, the second game in the series. Technically, Silent Hill, the first one, got a remake on the Wii called Shattered Memories, but are we really counting that? Oh, we are? Oh, alright, whatever. To be fair, Silent Hill 2 is a generally well-loved game and has even popped up on a few best games of all time lists. It seems to be a fan favorite and there seems to be some actual hype for the remake. I guess we'll see how it turns out, assuming they ever give us a release date. I've been meaning to get into the series for a couple of years now, and this seems like as good a time as any to just dive right in. And just like Konami, I am skipping the first game entirely and going straight to the second. I might be 22 years late to the party, but I finally managed to play Silent Hill 2, and it's pretty good. Shocker, I know. A well-received classic horror game actually turned out to be good. Who could have seen that coming? Something that did surprise me about this game is that I think it aged surprisingly well. Or most of it did, but we'll get to that in a second. I think the atmosphere is absolutely top-notch and some of the best I've ever experienced. The story is deep and personal in a way Resident Evil could only ever hope to achieve. Puzzle solving is top notch, and the combat, well, actually the combat is some of the worst I've ever had to endure, but still, 3 out of 4 for a 22-year-old game, not bad. The game stars everyman James Sunderland as he travels to the town of Silent Hill after receiving a mysterious message from his presumed dead wife. Wait, something about that feels a bit familiar, but never mind. Upon arriving at the town of Quiet Mountain, James discovers the whole place is deserted and filled with bizarre monsters. The opening of this game is absolutely amazing, and the way everything is introduced leaves the player with so many unanswered questions. What is going on in this crazy ass town? Why are there very unfriendly mannequin creatures everywhere? Who are all these other people that seem to be drawn to Silent Hill? Why is one of them a literal child? I love how this game sets everything up and leaves so many mysteries on the table right from the get. It's immediately captivating. The story, along with the atmosphere, were the main things driving my desire to play more. It sure as hell wasn't the gameplay. The music wonderfully sets the tone, and it's not very often that the soundtrack of a game stands out to me so much. Also, the sounds of everything else pretty much, and how they are used in the environments up the creep factor by a ton. The enemies make some skin-crawling noises, especially when they are literally crawling around. James also has an optional radio thingy on him that crackles with static when an enemy gets too close, and it never failed to put me on edge. The enemies are also so eerie in their design, and watching them emerge from the fog was hair-raising. I really like the enemies in terms of how they look. The muted colors aren't a personal favorite of mine typically, but I think it worked really well for these things. And they actually felt like a threat at first. At least until I found the piece of wood with a nail sticking out of it, and I just started beating them to death. If I'm being completely honest, this is where the game loses a ton of momentum in the scariness department. As soon as I was able to fight back, it turned out the enemies just kind of weren't really a big deal. Killing them was super easy, barely an inconvenience. It was tedious, sure, and kind of boring because all I had to do was stand in one spot and tap the attack button repeatedly until it stopped moving. It took a hot sec, but if it meant I no longer had to deal with that enemy, then it kind of seemed like the right way to play, for me at least. Friends of the channel, Jonathan Hawkins and Kelly Osborne of the Vengeful Retreat, said that I should just run around the enemies since that was easy enough. But in my mind, putting them out of my misery was simply a better option. They typically did a good job of staying dead, so it just made moving around the tighter areas like the apartments and the hospital so much easier. Obviously, in the wide open spaces of the streets, it was better to just avoid them, but you don't spend a lot of time on said streets, so yeah. I would just very easily beat them to death, and they pretty much stop feeling like a threat at that point. You do eventually get guns, but using them for anything other than the boss fights seemed like a waste of ammo, so more beating them to death with sticks, I guess. Hey, you know what? Since I mentioned boss fights, let's go ahead and get into those real quick. They are fucking horrible. You just run to one side of the room, shoot the stupid thing for a bit, then run around it to the other side of the room and rinse and repeat until either it or you die. Which is honestly whatever. The old school Resident Evil games basically do the same thing, but for some reason I can't quite articulate. I hate it so much more here. Maybe it's the terrible enemies like this pervy mattress that does something to your head when it gets too close and you get stuck in this god-awful animation for several seconds. Maybe it's the fact that every boss fight but the last one takes place in the smallest area possible, so you barely have any space to work with, which naturally pairs really well with the shitty tank controls that already make it difficult to maneuver. And despite the fact that the last boss fight takes place in the biggest space, it's still impossible to ever move due to you constantly being swarmed with what I'm pretty positive are bats. I mean, it's probably a combination of all those elements that just completely obliterated my enjoyment of the fights, but I seriously didn't like a single one. Well, maybe the Pyramid Head one, but I think it's just because I always liked his look. He's cool, and his role in the story is actually pretty fascinating too. I've always been aware of old Triangle Face in theory. I've seen pictures of him and seen him in videos before. He was also in Dead by Daylight that one time, but all this time I never knew the significance and context of the character. Knowing all of that now makes me so confused on why he appears anywhere else but Silent Hill 2. His whole existence and meaning is tied directly to James, and his repeat appearances in the franchise significantly lessen his impact, which is whack because like I said, I really like his whole vibe and what he brings to the game. I completely understand why he's so popular, and how they handle him in the remake should be interesting to say the least. I would be shocked if Bloober Team doesn't turn Pyramid Head into a stalker type enemy like another famous survival horror enemy that's fond of fedoras that also appeared in the remake of the second game in the series. Not to say that it can't be done right, I just think that the very specific and intentional encounters with Pyramid Head in Silent Hill 2 work to the favor of the game's bigger mystery. Overexposure is the antithesis of good mystique, so in cases like this one, less is truly more. From what I saw in Silent Hill 2, it seems like these games place a sizable amount of importance on the story in a way its contemporary Resident Evil does not. Not that Resident Evil has bad stories or anything, it's just those are very gameplay driven, whereas Silent Hill seems to be more story driven. Resident Evil's use of horror always consists of body and physical horror. The horror-y elements are the monsters and their grotesque appearances and transformations combined with how you survive against them with limited resources. However, Silent Hill takes a somewhat different approach. There's still the monsters and puzzle solving and limited resources, in theory, but they focus more on psychological and symbolic horror. Everything has a meaning and a message behind it. They don't exist just to look scary. They exist to look scary and represent a deeper facet of the story. One of the things I enjoyed most about experiencing Silent Hill 2's story was peeling back the layers to find the meaning buried in the visuals. The core of Silent Hill 2 is a surprisingly complex and thoughtful story of guilt, grief, love, and lust. Before I get more into that, this is full-blown spoiler territory, so you know the drill. If you don't want this game spoiled for you, then dip out now, and leave a like on your way out. We appreciate you. Otherwise, let's talk more about the story. James Sunderland receives a letter from his super dead wife Mary that tells him that she's waiting for him in their old homestead of Silent Hill. Once he arrives, he finds that Silent Hill is covered in a bizarre fog, and while exploring it, he meets a few others who were mysteriously drawn back to the Spooksville. There's Angela, a runaway searching for her mother, Laura, a little girl who apparently knew James's late wife, and Eddie, who is also there. Among them, James also meets Maria, a woman who looks identical to his wife Mary, but swears she's never heard of her before. There's one big connection between all of these characters: guilt. I won't get into the specifics, but each character we meet in Silent Hill is guilty of something they are unable to move past. Well, except for Maria, who actually might be the most interesting character in the game. See, Maria is this sort of idyllic version of Mary that James' twisted little mind invents. It goes way deeper than that, but all you need to know is that Maria is a representation of not just his guilt, but also his sexual frustration. Actually, a lot of the symbolism ties in with his sexual frustration, like whatever the f is happening here. As I mentioned earlier, Pyramid Head is directly tied to James because Old Triangle Face is a manifestation of his guilt, one that was specifically created to punish him. What exactly is James guilty of, you might ask? Well, killing his wife, of course. I'm not gonna lie and pretend that this was some big revelation I didn't see coming. Even from the beginning, I had an inkling about what was going on with Jimbo, and I was right. It's honestly fine though. It did not affect my enjoyment of the rest of the story, which I personally think is a triumph by the writers. The story isn't just about James either. The other characters also tie in with the themes of the game flawlessly. Not one of the characters feels out of place. There's so much nuance and subtlety in the way the game sets everything up and trickle feeds the player details that you just can't help but stay invested, even if you have a pretty good hunch about what is going on in the town of Quiet Mountain. For me, this was a refreshing way to experience the story of a survival horror game, especially considering I mostly play Resident Evil games. Silent Hill 2 takes itself seriously enough that I end up taking it seriously, while also not being afraid to embrace its silliness at times. Like with the dog ending, which is something, alright. I do worry a bit about the story of the remake, considering it's in the hands of developers who aren't exactly known for their subtlety, but that doesn't necessarily mean they can't handle it. I'm not holding my breath though. Silent Hill 2 is a fantastic game, it's as simple as that. The biggest thing that holds it back for me is the combat and boss fights, but they really aren't enough to sour the whole experience. Everything else is just handled so damn well. The environments are unsettling to explore and filled with some really good puzzles that are just the right kind of hard. And even if you do still find them too difficult, then you can actually change the difficulty of the puzzle in the game without affecting the combat, which is just awesome. The level design is pretty standard for a survival horror, but there's nothing wrong with that, it's done well. If you can give me pretty good levels that look great and leave me anxious as I turn every corner, then that is a win in my book. To top it all off, there is a really good story that doesn't treat the player like they're stupid. It doesn't have to explain everything because it trusts you to make the connections and come up with your own interpretations. The story also features multiple endings, ranging from super depressing to just kinda depressing, so that's nice. I'm pretty sure I got the Leave ending the first time I played, if anyone was curious. If you haven't played this game and can get your hands on it, then you should definitely give it a shot. It's a classic for a reason, and I really liked it. Well, I've been Tin from Tin and Maxx, and thank you for watching another one of whatever these videos are. I hope you liked it. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more like this, and I will see you in whatever I do next.